Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're exploring the Springboot framework, and how we're going to go about this is by building a very simple application called a bill splitter. So like its name suggests, the objective of this application is to receive an input of items and people who are going to split the bill for this list of items. And this very simple API service will return back exactly how much each of these people who's splitting the bill should pay. So the objective of this exercise is to have a hands-on experience of how do we create a simple application using the Springboot framework. And the Springboot framework is a very simple backend framework which is used to create like scalable Java applications. So in my experience, I have not touched Springboot in production before. So I'm pretty new to this framework, but I had my fair share of experience using other frameworks in other languages. For example, I used the Flask and the Django framework, Fast API in Python, and I have also used similar frameworks such as Play using Scala. So Springboot framework is a model view controller framework, and it's pretty similar to these frameworks I've mentioned. So with that, my assumption is that it must be pretty similar. So in this exercise, I'll be showing you candidly how I would break down the different parts of this framework as a beginner and explore the documentations as we go. So in this first part, we will be exploring the design specification of this application. And once we have the design specifications down, we will start creating the first part of the application, the controller. So the controller is responsible for routing the requests to specific functions that should be called. So in this case, you can call that the view. The view is somewhat like the data or what the client will see based on which route they hit. And of course, this view contains data and they need data models to represent it. So we'll be creating some data models specifically for the items as well as the users. So that's pretty much an overview of what we'll be doing. You might also ask, okay, so will there be databases? Would there be other API services that we call? In this case, our objective is to understand the framework. So as much as we want to, we should try to minimize the moving parts in this project so that we can isolate and focus more on the framework. So that's my objective. My objective would be to come up with a very simple application, small enough to play around with the framework and not include too much moving parts so we can focus more on the framework itself. So with that, let's get started. So the first part, the first thing I'm going to do is to define the high-level overview of this project. So we want to design a bill splitter. So we would have a service, and this service would be built in Springboot. So okay, this is really, really small. So let me reduce the size of this font. Yes, so this is the bill splitter. Backend. And for this purpose, let's assume that we would have a front end as well. We will not be touching the front end in this case, of course, but when we design a backend, it would also help to understand how the front end will be using it. So let's say that we have a very simple Telegram chatbot, let's say. And this Telegram chatbot would be smart enough to decide how they should use our backend. So the Telegram chatbot would be used by, let's assume, a group of friends, a group of users. And in this case, they would have a list of items. So the first part is the items, I guess. And for each of these items, there is a name, there is a price, and in this case, there's also the quantity. And in this case, for the sake of this exercise, typically there will be some ID involved to deduplicate items. For example, it's possible that each user would buy the same item. So in this case, I'm going to assume that the item name in this case would be unique for the sake of simplicity. Of course, in production, we would typically assign it an ID. But for the purpose of this exercise, let's assume that our users will pass us unique names, unique item names in this case. We will also have users. And similarly, in this case, they would have a name as well. And similarly, for the sake of simplicity, let's assume that the users of our application are going to be unique as well. So we can focus more on just the application over here. So let's say the Telegram chatbot will be sending us a simple payload like this. So they'll be giving us a JSON, so a list of items, so looking something like this. Okay, let's zoom in a little bit. Okay. Okay, nice, much better. Okay, and now let's try to define the JSON over here. So the first part would be a list of items like this. And these items over here would be a list of dictionaries, I would say. So this dictionary over here would contain the same three fields that we mentioned earlier. The first one would be the name of the item. So let's say cola. And there's also the price of each item. So let's say this is 2. This can be a floating value, and we'll just take it as simple US dollars. We also have quantity. And this represents the quantity of items that we have over here. So in this case, the quantity, let's say there is 10. So there is like a combined total of 10 items, 10 colas. So in this case, let's just assume that these items here are all we have for this payload. And we also have some users as well. And in this case, let's say for this very simple payload, okay, I'm just going to erase this later. I will draw the arrow later. So in this case, let's say we only have, let's say Bourbon. And that's about it. So our payload will look something like this. And now our user, our Telegram bot, would send this payload to the backend service. So our backend service would read this payload, and it will give back a response, something like this. So let's say you have a list of users. And in this case, this would be a dictionary. And for this, it would have a name for each of these users. So let's say Bourbon. And they would have a total that indicates the total price that they need to pay. So in this case, we can see that Bourbon is solely responsible for paying for these 10 bottles of cola. So in this case, the total bill would be 20 US dollars. And of course, it would help if we return back a receipt as well. So it would be nice if we can break down the list of items that Bourbon is paying for. So in this case, we can include items. And similarly, in this case, this would be the list of items that Bourbon is paying for. So over here, there would be name, name cola, the original price. So in this case, there is 10 bottles. Oops, okay, let me do this. Oh wow, okay, this eraser is really huge. Okay, let's make it a little smaller. Okay, the price would be $20, and in this case that would be a quantity. This represents the number of bottles that we are talking about. Okay, and now we can also have a list of people who we are splitting this with. So in this case, there's only Boban. So that's about it. So we have a closing dictionary here. We have a closing square bracket here. Okay, sorry. Yes, a closing square bracket for items. And we would have a closing bracket. And finally a closing square bracket. So this is quite, let me just check. So this is for, this bracket is for this bracket is for this. Okay, this bracket is for this, yeah, let me correct this. I think I confused myself a little over here. But this square bracket over here is for items. And we have a closing bracket for this indentation for this list of users, and finally a closing bracket. So it's a bit of a mess. It'd be nice if I typed it out better, but you get the idea. So in a sense, we will be returning back a list of users, and this would be a list of users. And inside this list of users, there's the name, total, as well as, like, the total represents the bill that Boban needs to pay for, as well as the items that breaks down exactly the items that Boban is paying for, along with the people that Boban is splitting with. So these items over here is really meant to be a working for why the price is like this now. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So for the next part, we'll be focusing on how we would be creating this backend service over here. So the first part is probably the router. So let me draw a bigger box so that I have more space. Let me erase this so that there's more space to draw stuff. Okay, nice. So the first part is probably something called the router. Or rather, I would say this is the controller, and the router is really a part of it. And the controller has one responsibility. Its responsibility is to control who sees what. In this case, like who in this case is the client, and what in this case represents the data. So in this case, we'll be creating a single route, and this controller in this case is going to be very simple. There's just going to be one single view. And this view over here is going to be responsible for splitting bills. And some of you parrots would notice, oh, okay, so do you mean that an application have multiple views? And in this case, yes. But in this case, we have a single view, and the view in this case represents the data, the so-called the data that you see, and the data in this case represents the split bill in this case. And for this view over here, for this view that is responsible for splitting the bill for a list of items and users, we will also have some data models. And as you might guess, like these data models over here would be seen here as well. So we would probably have a class of, we will probably have some input models, input data models. And as you might guess, the input data models would correspond with what we see over here. So we would have input data models for the item and another input data model for the user. So specifically, we will have we'll probably have a class item which have 3 attributes. We have name, it's probably of type string. We have a price, which is probably of type double. And we also have a quantity, which probably of type integer. So similarly for the user, we will also have a name attribute, and this is a string. And in this case, I I guess I should call this item input and user input, because as you might guess, like the structure of our user and items look quite different for the output, right? So in this case, it's going to be class input user, class output user. So something like this. So we have one data class like here, another data class here. So, oh my, I made a mistake there. I should have called this input. Okay, so now that we define our input models, we will probably define our output models as well. So over here, we can see that we are returning back a list of users. So let's define a high level output user class. And this output user class represents not just the details of the user, it also represents the items and the total price that this user should pay. So in this case, let's say there is a string name. So this name attribute represents the name of the user, and of course there's a total. So I guess in this case, it shouldn't be an integer, it should be a double, because we have cents in there. So double total. And we also have items. So in this case, it's going to be a simple list of items, output items, which we will define in a bit. So this is going to be items. Yes. So yeah, that's about it. So that's it for the output user. And finally, the final data class which we'll be talking about is the output items themselves. So this is one more data class, and we have output item. So in this case, we have, as we can see from the JSON, we have a string name of the item. We also have the price. So this is a double. So price, we have a quantity. So this is an integer. And we have the people. Oh, so we have another list of people. So in this case, I'm going to create a simple class called slim user, which contains only its name. So string name. And you might ask, some of you smart parrots might ask, oh wow, okay, but doesn't this slim user look very similar to this input user right here? And yes, you're right. But in this case, I would prefer not to reuse classes. I would try not to mix input classes with the output class data types. So there is like a separation of responsibility, because we have these two input classes responsible for representing the data model of the input data. So I wouldn't want to mix it with the data classes of the output. So for that purpose, I'll be creating just a very simple slim user that just have that name over there. So yeah, that's about it. So people, in this case, back to where we are seeing here, we see that people over here is a list of people. So let's change this type here. This will be a list of slim users, and this would be people. Yep, and that's it. I was expecting 4 classes, but I guess I missed out some details as I was thinking out loud. But you can see that we have 1 input data class, 2 input data classes, and we have 3 output data classes. So we have 1, 2, and 3. And as you might guess, we will also have somewhere in this, these are the models, by the way. So somewhere in the view layer, we'll be defining a service called a bill splitter service that is responsible for splitting the bills, responsible for taking in the input data models and giving us back the output data models. So we can start defining that. And for our viewers, for our parrots out there, yes, like the service is going to be somewhere inside this view layer over here. But you can start to see why this framework is called model view controller, because they are abstracting 3 different layers in this framework. They have a controller responsible for delegating requests from the clients to specific views. And the view itself represents the data, the logic, the UI, whatsoever. And finally, we have the models that's responsible for representing our data. So that's about it. So one final detail, which is how are we going to split this? Like, what exactly is the interface going to look like? So we're going to define something called a class, a build splitter service. And this build splitter service, it doesn't have any dependencies. So it doesn't have a database. It doesn't have a cache whatsoever. First, we can add it next time. I guess we could build on top of this project to introduce more concepts. But for now, let's just say that this build splitter service is only responsible for taking in input data and returning back output data. So you can imagine that we'll probably have like a very simple interface over here. So let's take in, let's see, we have input user and did I just call this incorrectly? Okay, I'm sorry for the confusion over here, but this thing over here, this first class represents the input items. I'm sorry for the confusion there, but this is the input item and this is the input user. So now that we have the input item and the input user, okay. So we'll be taking in a list of items and a list of users to split it with. Okay, sounds great. And what about the output type then? I guess we can return back a list of output user. Yeah, sounds good. Okay, so that sounds great. So let's return back a public. In this case, there's no dependencies. Our build splitter service doesn't have any attributes that we would need to split stuff with. So let's call this a static method. And public static, in this case, is going to return back a list of output users. So list of output user. And let's call this split build. And this split build is going to take in a list of items. Input item. Let's call these items. And let's call the second one a list of input user. Yep. And this is going to be our interface. So the implementation, we can leave that to later, but you can see that we're just going to implement a very simple method. This method will take in a list of items and a list of users that you want to split the items for. And once done, we will return back a list of output users. And this output user have a total for each of these users along with the items that each of these users are paying for. So that's pretty much it for this project. And this blue splitter service over here is going to be somewhere inside this view layer over here. And that's it for this planning. As you might have guessed, this is a very simple project. There is no caching, there's no database. We could have stored the items and the users and persist it in the database so that in the future, if users come and use this build splitter service again, they can fetch the previous items that they were dealing with. And we could also keep track of who are the users who are using this simple build splitter. But for the sake of understanding Springboot framework, I would vote that this is just right for exploring the Springboot framework. So with that, that's it for the first part of the video. In the second part of the video, we'll be diving deep into the documentations to understand what tools we have for the Springboot framework, and we will start building it step by step, starting from the controller all the way down to the models, and finally getting back the output. So with that, that's it for this first part video, and we will see you in the next one.